G'day guys, this is CW bringing you another episode of HashItOut. Today, Armeanio and Noah are joining me to discuss decentralization. Welcome, gents.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you guys. So decentralization, the terms thrown around that sort of will in the blockchain sort of protocols and by blockchain protocols and decentralized finance platforms. What does it really mean to be decentralized and even open source for that matter? So let's sort of hash that out.
Yeah, Joe, I know you had some tweets about this, I think today or yesterday, just talking about sort of the state of DeFi and the future of DeFi and what it means to be DeFi having to be open source. So maybe you can kick us off here.
Sure. So let's start with open source, because I think that's like the most critical part of decentralization.
Most definitely.
Right? And basically what that means is you have the ability to look and take apart the code. We live in a world where we have all these fancy electronics around us. And yeah, it's true. Once you have a, let's say, device locally, you could always take it apart, learn about it, learn how it's wired together. But what actually makes it run? What actually makes it work? What's it programmed to do? What is actually happening? Now, beyond the hardware, you need access to the code to be able to figure that out. And absent that level of transparency, how do you trust it?
Yeah, I think that's the key factor here actually is trust. Obviously, open source, you can dive into everything. You need code to run hardware, like you did mention. But being able to sort of trust the infrastructure that everything's running on and then know the rules that everyone's engaging in, I think that's a big factor.
Yeah, it's kind of on probably more than two levels, but two levels that I can think of where even if your network or system is, decentralized in that it's distributed across a large number of people, if the application itself, let's say, nobody really knows what's going on, it's technically decentralized, but it's still got this second layer of centralization around what's going on behind in the black box. Like when we were talking about this, I started thinking about helium miners and how it's kind of, there's a lot of people running them all over the world, but it's kind of just a chip in a box, and you have to buy it from a few people, and that doesn't strike me as truly decentralized.
Yeah, decentralized network, but then it's a bit running on sort of proprietary hardware and software.
Exactly.
I really don't think you can have decentralization without open source. I really don't. The reason why is because it will always break down to who controls the code, right? Having it open, let's say that, everyone in the core Ergo team got on a flight and it crashed, right? Everything that has been built in the Ergo core is open source. So anybody anywhere in the world can access it and can continue that work. If you have a black box, you have a single point of failure, right? And, the idea in decentralization is to distribute trust so that you can have the assumption that the network's not going to be controlled, right? That's the entire point. Everyone's like, 51% attack. They understand that, if someone gains a majority of the hash rate, then the assumption that the network is secure is broken, right? But beyond that, with everything that's built on top of these networks, trust assumptions kind of fade away. And then we get into like the sexiness of tokens and, sales and, marketing schemes. And I wish that crypto users had like the same level of adherence to what are my assumptions.
Yeah, that's an important point as well. What should people sort of be asking themselves when it comes to sort of operating or even interacting with these decentralized platforms?
Well, I think what recent market events have shown us. You could look at, let's say, some of these funds that, did some initial seed offerings with a bunch of stuff, invested in a lot of networks, and then had massive counterparty risk off chain. Looks like things blew up, and now they're just in the wind. Like, how crazy is that? It ultimately had a single choke point, a single point of failure, and who knows whether they just like cashed out on a hard wallet and are on the lam. I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting sort of space because you see these massive funds or accumulation of funds, and then you can see when everything's moving upwards in the market sort of side of things, you're borrowing from one platform to pay debts on the other, and you just end up in that death spiral when it does turn.
Well, there's no transparency. I mean, that's what it all breaks down to, in my opinion, is transparency. Like, even if you have open source code, and even if, let's say, there is a bug or an exploit in that code or something is not programmed right, at least it's transparent, it's in the open. And what happens more often than not is when that's pointed out, you have a collaborative effort to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
In the current sort of market state, in the state of crypto industry, to me it seems like there's sort of a sliding scale of decentralization and also open source.
Mm-hmm.
And in the world we live in, people want to make money, and any kind of proprietary edge that you can maintain by keeping your code closed source is an edge. And I think inevitably there's going to be closed source, you know. So, with the way things being that they are, how do you see, just as far as, prioritization, like which projects should be more open source versus, if there is going to be a closed source project, how do the cards fall on that?
I think it should break down to value. Honestly, I think if something is going to try to be value and move a lot of value, people need to see how that works. That needs to be transparent. I understand that, open source isn't necessarily popular, right? Among, let's say, the people that want to keep things proprietary and have some sort of advantage. But I also think there are huge trade-offs to that. The first is when you have open source, you have community review, right? Mm-hmm. You have the ability to bring people in, and ultimately what that tends to do is it tends to accelerate development, right? So let's say that just for fun, some big fund came and said, we're going to build something that's proprietary and closed source on Ergo. Okay, how does that help the ecosystem as a whole, right? It doesn't. It might give us some users or some marketing, but in terms of all of the other developers, it's not going to be like a community asset. And when code is open and transparent, what you find is innovation. People come in, they pick it apart, they improve it. And ultimately, I think that level of transparency accelerates things, and it allows you to see real problems, right? When you can't see, what's happening, how do you know there's a problem? And if you don't know there's a problem, how do you fix it?
Yeah, I think that acceleration is a really good point as well, because you're not having to code things twice, 3 times, 5 times in advance sort of thing. You can take sort of these frameworks that have sort of been built in the past, which we know has been proven to work, etc. And then it sort of cuts down the dev time for whatever platform's working there. I think in regards to sort of the sliding scale in regards to decentralization, it's an interesting point because there's going to be multiple parties operating in this sort of on these protocols. So you're going to have large enterprises with private side chains, for instance, and things like that. But I think the rails that everything actually runs on should 100%, be totally open source for decentralization.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too.
Public infrastructure. Oh, sorry, no.
No. Go ahead. please.
I was just going to say, I look at many things as like private infrastructure, right? So if it's public infrastructure and everyone on the chain can see it, that's very different than having like a private service. Am I against those source stuff on the chain? No, because I can't do anything about it, right? Why would I be bothered about something I can't control? I'm not. But I think that the value that open source development brings is worth it. I hear a lot of gimmicks in this space. I hear like, oh, it's unaudited code. That's the most common one. And it's like, what do you think the point of open source code is? Community audit. That's like the one of the greatest security benefits of open source. Sometimes I hear, about competitive advantage, but the reality is you can't fork community, right? You really can't. If you get people involved and engaged, they tend to stick around. Now, it is true that in other blockchains, we've seen like a race to the bottom. Okay. And what that means is like, okay, well, I'm going to just copy you and then try to charge a lower rate. Right. And that's inevitable to some degree. I think even with closed source code, that's going to inevitably be like a market force. But the trade-off that you get by sacrificing the innovation of open source, in my opinion, isn't worth it.
Yeah, I think so too. And I really like what you said about like a public infrastructure. To me, it feels like a layer one blockchain like Ergo. It's aiming to be a systemic force almost. It's like the lifeblood of all these different DApps and services and things like that. For that to be closed source just doesn't make any sense. And like you were saying, there's going to be private companies that build on Ergo, and I get it there. And like an example in our own ecosystem is Sky Harbor. Right now they're closed source just for the time being, while they're in beta and while they're building out their contracts and stuff. And I know that they plan to go open source at some point too, but yeah, for a project like them, it's different than if Ergo was to be closed source. Like it would be ridiculous.
I think Sky Harbor serves a purpose as a service, right?
Yeah,
it does have probably better, well, definitely better like scam prevention than that. Decentralization sometimes can be messy when there's no, let's say, person in control, and at least in like the NFT setting, certainly. But then the other question is, I honestly, the first thing I did when I heard that is I called them. I talked to them. Hey, where are you guys head at? Why are you doing this? What's up? Not to like accuse them of anything, just to learn what their thinking was. And I'm not against it. They can build on the network. I think as a service, it's pretty nice. But then you have to ask the question, okay, well, if you have access to, we could look at something like OpenSea, right? OpenSea's had some sketchy shit going on, where they know what's going to happen. They know what, NFTs are going to go on the front page. There's insider trading. There's, there is some level of, let's just say, sketchiness that can occur without that type of transparency, right? That you have, I don't think Sky Harbor is doing that. That's not an accusation. I actually think they've done a pretty good job trying to be open, but you automatically have gatekeeping, the ability to, manipulate things from the inside. And in my opinion, I wouldn't call it a DApp. I'd call it a blockchain service, because I can't understand, let's say, the trust assumptions involved. Now, is it a valuable service? Sure. I think it offers some benefits over the open source alternative. So I can't say, I'm against it, but I think that whenever you have these areas where they're black boxes, you say, okay, well, what's the worst possible scenario that can happen here? And you have to understand that before you move into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the key is to have options. Like we've talked about that before. I know, I don't remember when we've talked about it, but having options to choose. We have the auction house in Sky Harbor, and it'd be great if there were 4 others too. Like having options of varying levels of decentralization or closed source or open source, and then users can make their own judgments on what they feel comfortable using based on risk and trust. And that's the goal, I think, for me at least.
Yeah, if there were going to be anybody that was going to build closed source, I'm pretty happy it was, Hazy and Quelka, because they have a pretty decent reputation, right?
Yep.
They've been involved in the community. They're active in the community. People, like, they've built a reputation here. So I think there's a little bit of trust, or there is a lot of trust there, I would say. You brought up dApps, so interesting sort of concept, which people throw around the terminology sort of wildly as well. And then obviously you just touched on blockchain services. Do you want to sort of explain what your thoughts are regarding what you consider a dApp and what a blockchain service is?
Sure. I break it down to one question. Can I run it locally?
Yep.
Can I run it locally on my own computer and take it apart, look at it? Or do I have to rely on other parties? Because, if you look at what is decentralization of a blockchain, if we go back to like when Bitcoin first started, what made it unstoppable is there were so many nodes and anybody could download a node. Even if you didn't mind, you could still have the entire history of the network, on locally. So I think that when you have the ability to run all of the software locally, then it's truly a dApp, because that third party could, crash on a plane, and guess what? I still have the source code on my computer. I'm no longer reliant on them or their infrastructure. I can host everything locally and kind of control my own code.
Yeah,
and so that's what I would consider a dApp. When you get into like, okay, you have to go through their server and, hopefully everything is working right. You have a dependency. So I wouldn't call it a decentralized application. I would call it a service.
Yeah, just to be clear as well, we're not wishing anyone to crash on an airplane. So touch wood that doesn't happen. I think a clear example of what a dApp actually is would be the Ergo mixer. You have the ability to run it all locally. You can point it to any node that you want. I think that's really sort of really good example of what a dApp actually is.
I would say that's probably the gold standard in the Ergo space, and it's a true dApp. But it needs to be being its functionality. If it's going to be a true mixer, it does need to be decentralized.
Yeah,
because what happens when something is distributed locally, it becomes unstoppable.
Yeah. I was just about to say, it's quite amusing to myself personally, where people sort of try and hide behind the cloak of competitive advantage at times and things, because if you actually look at the infrastructure that all this sort of stuff is running on, it's, well, for the most part, depending on the blockchain, it's all open source as well. So like you mentioned as well, you can't fork a community. You can fork the code, but the community is where the value is actually lying, in my opinion.
Well, for me, when I first kind of came out and started doing videos in the community, one of the first things I said is, if you build open source, I'm on your team. Why? Because it's like public infrastructure, right? It not only benefits users, it benefits developers, but it benefits the growth and development of the community as a whole. So, anytime I see somebody building things that are open source, I'm on their team. Why? Because their code is public, it's shared, it's like it's mine and yours and Noah's, and we all have the ability to take it and play with it and look at it and maybe even learn. If you were new coming into the Ergo ecosystem and you had the ability to download, take apart, and look at how all of the different applications work, you have basically like a masterclass in front of you if you're willing to take it. Versus if you come into a community where everything is closed source, then it's going to be much more difficult to achieve greater adoption in the development community.
Yeah, I think one of the major factors in regards to infrastructure is wallets, having those open source and clear, and knowing sort of how transactions are built and what you're signing and things like that. I think that's one of the most major sort of pieces of infrastructure from the end user perspective that should be open source.
Yeah, I have a thought that's kind of shifting gears away from that, but the conversation about being able to download the D app, making something actually decentralized. How do you guys think, like web hosting plays into this whole conversation with like user interfaces being accessible? Because, I was thinking if a D app can be run offline and contracts can be accessed offline, just like through command line or something. But for the average user, that's not really achievable. And the only way for them to be able to realistically interact with it is through an online interface. How it kind of muddies the waters a little bit, like if
we have a thing called the headless DApp framework, where you have the ability to access smart contracts from multiple UIs. I think that's a great way for developers to compete. We've already seen that even, if you look at what TokenJ is doing with SigUSD, they said, okay, well, we're going to build a mobile application that's pretty streamlined and it's actually a lot cheaper. So that type of competition, I think, is good. I think that open source code helps deliver that. Now, what if we had 20 different UIs that, even if they reach some sort of parity in fees, we suddenly learn, okay, well, what do people prefer? What do people like? And then what if the next developer that wants to build a decentralized application carries that knowledge forward and plugs it in? Boom, you have innovation. I mean, that's a part of why I think open source is such a powerful driver for innovation, because the reality is a lot of disruptive change come from small specialized groups, not let's say behemoths that kind of, they tend to be slow is the bottom line. Slow and bureaucratic, versus when you get open source, sometimes it's messy. Sometimes in like the initial stages things are messy, but what happens is they get more solid over time, right? Yep. We had a bug come out in terms of like, I think it was NFTs getting burned last weekend, and that's painful to see, but the reality is because it's open source, everybody can see it. Now we have multiple developers looking into it, and we're stronger as a result, right? That's sometimes a part of growth in software. Versus if it happened in a black box and everyone said, what happened? Sometimes who knows if they're even going to disclose what actually happened.
Yeah, you get a whitewashed post-mortem and it's like, who actually knows?
Nothing to see here.
Yeah. That level of transparency is powerful. It really is. I mean, there are not that very many systems and or businesses in this world that have that level of transparency that you can see all the way through it. Like you go to a restaurant, where they get their food from, who are their suppliers. There's so many like just assumptions we don't know. You just kind of trust it anyway. And I don't know, hope you don't get food poisoning in that case or something. But having that level of transparency in terms of how things work, and to know that you're not being exploited, but also, it's an educational tool and it's a collective security tool. It's very powerful.
It's cool to watch the dev channel, like with that conversation about the NFT stuff. And like right now, there's a lot of ongoing discussion about the future of the network with 5.0, and like there's a lot of stuff going on in the dev channel, and just being able to see just a Kushti and Morphic like going at it, like it's wild. It's wild, but it's super valuable. Like
it's like a marriage. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, no, they're always talking about design preferences, and that's just how they operate. But I would rather have that type of transparency. You can look in some parts of the crypto ecosystem where you have like multiple competing projects that nobody has open code, and they're talking shit to each other about who's the best, right? That doesn't even make sense. In my, like, if you don't even have a code or a product live, why don't you finish that first?
Or you go to their GitHub and it's like
Nothing.
6-month-old forks that have been like a README and that's it.
Yeah, and to some degree, I would say open source code serves as proof of development.
Yes.
Like
I definitely agree with that.
If I were going to have a project that either was going to tokenize in the future or had tokenized, I would want to have proof of development. I would want people to know, hey, I'm working on what I'm doing. And I think that's a powerful driver. Now, it is true that what we see in the crypto space is oftentimes outside investment, kind of specialized development that's closed source. People can come in with a lot of money, build something on a network, but it's a black box. You can make it shiny, you can have good marketing, but it's still a black box. And so in my personal opinion, open source is the way to go because you're not being controlled.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to mention in regards to sort of what Noah mentioned in regards to sort of the infrastructure that all this sort of runs on. I think it's the biggest sort of factor is not so much the web hosting, but the internet sort of hosting or the rails that the internet actually runs on. So I think it's actually sort of really essential to have a true P2P or P2P, P2P sort of network where everything sort of interacts just one-to-one, and it just has to have the internet connection to be able to connect and form consensus around the protocol.
Yeah, and Joe, maybe could you briefly sort of describe what the headless DApp system is for people who are watching?
Sure. So you kind of have the back end, which is going to be the smart contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was if we can create a framework where you have multiple front ends that can all make calls to the same smart contract, you kind of create an open, competitive market for user interfaces. And so, then it's like, okay, well, I don't know. Some people get very, I'm going to say picky about their interior design choices of their GUIs. I don't know. It's something I've always found a little funny in the space because the reality is most traders just chase liquidity, right? It's like what is that curve where it looks like it's some like retro 1995 user
arcade
interface
game sort of thing.
Yeah, but the bottom line is there's liquidity there, right? And so, people use it not because of how it looks, but because there's liquidity there to trade. And so, the general idea was, okay, well, what if we created an open marketplace where, you have back-end developers, which are usually fairly specialized, right? And then you have, front-end developers, which are usually a different animal. I mean, you do have some people that can do both, but usually people have a preference, right? Well, in a decentralized environment, what if we could connect them to where Noah, the backend developer, creates smart contracts, and without even, without even really needing to know or be on the same team, CW can spin up a front end. But then I can spin up a front end, and then we can kind of compete to try to give the best user experience in how it works. And so the initial goal was to try to create a connection between the back end and the front end without needing like a formal team.
Got it.
Which we've seen.
So,
Token J is the first example, I would say, of that.
So, excuse me, I'm not super familiar with this. I've heard about it, but I'm not super well read on it. So, does that apply to all DApps on Ergo? Is that something that a developer would kind of opt into with their back-end development?
No, I think it's something that people can choose to support. It could get messy if people didn't want to, but what you can have is a fee distribution, right? So like Token J takes a small fee, okay, and the smart contract on the back end has a small fee. So both parties are getting paid for their work. It's just a matter of saying, okay, well, if we can trustlessly connect them. We could just create a marketplace to compete. I don't know. I'm not so picky when it comes to user interfaces, but some people are. I've heard about it.
And that opens up cool opportunities for wallets to integrate stuff into the wallet. Like I think it's Minotaur that is working on having the SigUSD right in the wallet, so you could redeem RSV or Mint SigUSD. All of that just in the wallet itself. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I believe Mr. Stoffegg is doing the same with Mosaic.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the Mosaic framework where you can have all the dApps basically running in the wallet infrastructure. I know there's a couple on Cardano that are running that at the moment. I think Eternal is one of those where you can see the dApp actually in and interact with the dApp in the wallet itself. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, Cardano's a funny one though, because it comes down to the stake pool operators to be running the actual infrastructure. It's very different from Ergo, where anyone can have a node if they want to.
No, you can host like Daedalus, and you have a full node wallet.
Yeah, you can still
right, but
run
like as far as the like let's, for example, ErgoDex, like the off-chain bots, can anyone run those, or does it have to be a stake pool operator?
No, I believe they're going to open source it to where anyone can run it.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah,
that's one thing.
Misinformed on that one.
That's all right. That's one thing I appreciate, about what Ilya is doing is he is an open source developer.
Yeah.
And I think that has a tremendous amount of value, because guess what? I can download the back end and the front end code locally, and I can run it. So I don't need Ilya.
Mm-hmm.
Versus if you set up a system where it's like, okay, well, we have trusted parties and closed source code. Well, guess what? I now need somebody to interact with this, and that changes the assumptions that I need to make. Like, how do I know that closed source code isn't giving them some advantage, or perhaps some ability to mess around with how orders are coming in? I don't. You can't, right?
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of, like the scoopers for Sunday Swap, like all the transactions getting batched together.
Yeah, and they've it's basically proprietary the way they've set that up. They've just got a certain number of trusted parties that they've or entrusted to be able to run the scoopers. So the cool thing about, like you mentioned in regards to ErgoDex and opening up the batching solution to everyone, anyone can basically earn a small fee potentially and run this infrastructure. It's not sort of centralized in that respect.
Well, here's the thinking, cool. Right? The thinking is that, if you create like a sterile environment, it'll be safe, right? That's generally the thinking with that type of setup. But with like ErgoDex, right? Let's say that Noah, the genius developer, decides that he's going to take apart the batching bot code from ErgoDex, and he's going to optimize it, right? Mm-hmm. And suddenly he's running a better version than everybody else in the network, right? That's the downside to open source innovation. Because ultimately that's what it is that you have the ability to potentially improve the code versus having like a trusted sanitary environment where it's pretty much probably don't touch things or we'll kick you out of the club.
Yeah, and I think we saw that with the ErgoDex bots for a while. I think there is some sort of memory pool and analysis happening, but Ilya fixed that too because he's a genius. Yeah, he's the genius developer, not me.
Yeah, but that's the downside to open source, right? Is somebody can take what you did and make it better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, driving that innovation.
It's funny because there are some developers that get excited about that.
Like they want their stuff to be broken and like.
Yeah, well, it's like enhanced. You built something that somebody took the time to take apart and improve.
Yeah.
And I would hope, that when that happens, there's either open source code or a community effort to, kind of engineer the same, because now you have an incentive to.
Mm-hmm. One sort of thing I want to sort of bring up as well is open source operating systems, and Linux being one of the major one that enterprises sort of utilize. I think that's a major sort of driver for innovation and running major infrastructure on these systems and being open source. I think that's a testament to open source policies and the future of open source as well.
Well, I think it breaks down to the security advantage over time, right? That's what it is. It's the security advantage over time. Like if I were to build like a new OS that's open source, it would probably have bugs, but give it a decade. Give it 2 decades of people reviewing it and combing over it. And, it's gone through community review, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times, and it becomes more solid. And guess what? Every once in a while, even then, there's still a bug that can pop up.
Yep.
We saw that last year.
Yes, the thing I like about it as well is the community aspect where everyone sort of enjoys the open source side of things. Like you mentioned, people get excited about people diving into their own code and sort of having a play and tinkering and things like that. It's like a badge of honor. But people wanting to join forces and sort of improve code or offer suggestions and things like that, I think it's pretty cool.
But it's a powerful community tool.
Yeah, it allows for a new development community to bootstrap so much faster too. I remember Quokka he's the guy behind Sky Harbor. He was talking about how in the beginning, before Sky Harbor and before a lot of the dApps that we see now, the auction house was like one of the most clearly developed. Like it was kind of like the Rosetta Stone of ErgoScript for a lot of new developers. Just being able to go through the auction house and reverse engineer stuff.
It's one thing to like learn about how a car works and how a car is assembled. It's a totally different thing to have it in front of you to where you can get your hands on it and take it apart and look at it.
Mm-hmm. And interact with it.
Exactly.
Exactly. In the live state that it is.
So I if someone wants to build a blockchain service on Ergo, go for it. Proof of development, build something cool. Hopefully, it's not in an area where the assumptions of control that you have, in your black box is a problem. Because if, let's say we had a closed source wallet, I would say don't use it. I wouldn't trust it. Now that's not popular, but I understand that the assumptions are, I can't say, and I don't want to try to store my coins or tokens where I can't say, that's a problem for me.
Yeah, that's sort of elaborating on what I was talking about. One being one of the major infrastructure things that I'd like to see is being open source is wallets, because who knows what backdoors are there or whether you truly have control of your private keys and everything like that, because ultimately that's everything for you when you're interacting with crypto is those private keys.
Yeah. And, like Sky Harbor as a service, it outperforms the auction house in certain areas. So, if you're new, if I have a new user that says, hey, where should I go to look at an NFT? I'd be more likely to say, hey, you should probably look at this place because, you don't know how to check transaction IDs and mint IDs, and you might not know how to kind of dive in and make sure that what you're buying is legitimate. So that's a real problem that they solve. So in that sense, I'm pretty happy they exist. I think they've done a great job. But they were also born from taking apart the auction house because it's open source. So I think at minimum having an open source framework that's continuing to improve and develop is important. I would be kind of sad to see closed source build with no competitor.
Yeah, that's kind of the most important thing is as long as there's an open source alternative to something closed source, it seems like a happy coexistence, so to speak.
Yeah. Let them compete. Open source creates a really nice development community. That's one of my favorite parts about Ergo as a whole is you look at the cross collaboration between, different developers, different projects, different wallet developers, because everything is open source. It's about delivering value more than just, I need to, outcompete you.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really enjoy about Ergo as well. Like you said, you got well, Quokka's a great example. He's one of the developers behind Sky Harbor, but he's just jumped over to the Night Owl team to offer his assistance there as well. Having that ability to do that, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, as I said, if anyone was going to build closed source, I was pretty happy with them, to be honest. Because I understand that given the wrong actor, that could get sketchy really quick. We've already seen that in the crypto space. So, this whole thing with Celsius and a lot of
now
these,
Voyager too.
Yeah, Voyager and BlockFi. Nothing was on chain. It was all in a black box. It was usually some people that had some sort of business reputation or clout. And so who the hell knows actually what happened? Who knows what kind of leverage and risk they were taking on, because nothing was transparent. It would be nice to live in a world where things were transparent. That's I would say, in terms of like the crypto ecosystem, in my opinion, is very backwards, where more often than not, it's like you have to KYC and you have to be fully transparent about who you are, right? But the idea is, if you've made a system that's fully transparent and trustless, why would that even matter? I think that the transparency should be shifted onto the code itself. And the assumptions that people should make. That way, the systems that we build, even if they're not, let's say fully safe today, we have a hiccup or a bug here or there, everyone sees it and it gets patched. And then over time, it gets, more and more solid.
Yeah. Builds out on that resilience.
And that's a powerful thing. But it's not good for marketing and sales.
I mean, nothing is right now, so just keep on.
Well, building. Yeah. I mean, right now you have over leveraged parties that, I still think there's probably a lot of unliquidated risk, to be honest.
I think so too.
I think I know everyone's saying like, everything is fine now and the storm has passed. But, the reality is, who knows what those characters that, that are on the lam, who knows what they even have, right? I don't know. I mean, did they pull all their assets and they're just running around, and I guess they probably owe those to somebody? And yeah, so I don't think this whole saga is finished. But the beautiful thing about all of this complete madness that has happened is it shows the real value of DeFi, because solid DeFi protocols are fine because everything was transparent to begin with.
Yeah, the rules are out there. The contracts operate as the way they have been written, and like Compound is one prime example there. It's just operating within the sort of realms of the code. There's no external influence or motion sort of being tied to this thing, and ultimately adding risk to the end user. It's the big word there is managing risk.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's been a pretty turbulent time, guys. I think we might wrap that up here in regards to sort of our discussion on decentralization and open source. It's been a pleasure. Is there any last words you want to say?
Yeah, I would say that if you want to build on Ergo, look at how it was first created, right? The tools that Alex built that predated Ergo and actually were kind of used in the engineering of the network were always built open source with the most relaxed license possible. Why? Because he likes to build stuff. That's the point.
Yeah, build things to enrich the everyday person. I think a prime example of that spelled out perfectly is in the Ergo Manifesto.
Yeah, I think final thing I'll say is I see a lot of new people coming into the community and asking about the Ergo team and how's development going in the Ergo team, and I think it's important to know, and I think it's relevant to this conversation, that there is not really an Ergo team. There's the Ergo Foundation and the developers that are funded by the Ergo Foundation.
Sure.
but there's a huge community of developers that are outside of the Ergo team, and yeah, they're just as valuable. And you know, a lot of the development that's going on is outside of the Ergo Foundation, and I think that's hard. It's a hard thing for a lot of people in the crypto space to understand, and it kind of makes me sad that that's the state of affairs. But
well, I think they look at it like a company.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you look at other chains. There's, I think it was Dan was mentioning at last AMA. Who's the guy for Ergo? There is no sort of guy or central entity, as you had alluded to in regards to. We do have the the Ergo Foundation, but there's not a major company behind Ergo developing it. It's the open source community. It's the community members hopping in and out of the official repos, offering suggestions and everything like that. It's a pretty cool concept.
And you know, the reality is almost all of the devs that the Ergo Foundation sponsors started just contributing.
Exactly.
They showed up and they did their own kind of proof of development, and everyone said, wow, this character is talented. We should, incentivize him to stick around because, the tools that are built are valuable. And, I think that's ultimately a really nice part of open source development is you do have people that, even come and go. Someone's, let's say they have their own life, their own family, their own, challenges, and sometimes they hop in and out. But it's kind of like just to share the goal.
Their legacy goes on.
Yeah. And there have been some that, will hop on when they have time, and then they'll kind of be ghosted for sometimes even months, and then they'll be back and they'll contribute something either on the weekend, and even if it's a small thing, it's valuable.
Mm-hmm. It's a nice way to say this as well is Ergo is proof of work in more ways than just consensus.
Yeah. I stick by that. If somebody builds open source, I'm on their team because I understand that what they build is, it's more than just them. It benefits everybody.
Yep. Nice way to sort of end that on that note as well. So anyone building in the Ergo ecosystem, if you want to open source all your code or build open source frameworks or contribute to the open source community, you have the backing of Armeanio and I dare say the Ergo Foundation in that respect. So gentlemen, it's been...
No,
go ahead.
I just said I'm always happy to help as I can. I'm not, I'm not the guy, but I'm certainly happy to help, when and where needed.
Yeah, most definitely.
Right.
Yeah, so excuse that interruption there. I was just going to wrap things up. So it's been a pleasure speaking once again, gentlemen, on this Hash It Out, where we discussed decentralization and open source frameworks. Thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
Always.
Nice chatting, guys.
Cheers. Have a good one.